The Joe Rogan Experience.
You've always been a staunch advocate for free speech, even when that speech is hate speech, and that's a very it's a difficult argument for people to have in this day and age because people want to ban hate speech. They want to ban people from talking. You've always been an advocate for free speech and saying that, like, even though it seems like it's a good idea to ban these ideas or to ban people discussing these things, in fact, it actually turns out to be a terrible idea.
Well, you see, when people say they want to ban hate speech, what they mean is they want to ban the speech that they hate.
Yes.
But if you allowed something called hate speech to be banned, then the only important question would be who decides. And again, if the government is going to be the one to decide what hate speech to ban, it's not going to be the same speech as the speech you hate. It's going to be the speech they hate. Think if, again, for liberals who are very hot these days about banning hate speech, what they mean is they want to ban speech that is bigoted against people based on skin color or based on sex or based on religion. That's what they mean by hate speech. But what I always ask liberals is, well, what makes you think you're going to have the power to decide what's hateful? You're never the ones who are going to have the power. What would happen if the guy who decided what speech to hate and ban was Joe McCarthy? He would have banned your speech. What if it was Giuliani, who tried unsuccessfully when he was mayor of New York to ban art in the Brooklyn Museum of Art that he didn't like because he thought it was disrespectful of his religion? And he hated that speech. Now, the speech he hated wasn't the same speech that I hated. The speech he hated wasn't the same speech as liberals or progressives hated, but he was the one who got to decide, not they. And that's the problem. That's really why hate speech cannot be a category that is allowed to ban, because it all depends on who's going to decide, and what they hate is not going to be the same as what you hate. In the 1990s, there was a big move on a lot of college campuses to ban hate speech. And what they meant by that is they wanted to ban racist speech. And a lot of black students were in favor of it. And I was then at the head of the ACLU, and I used to go around speaking to these audiences. And I had a very substantial reputation as being an advocate for racial justice and affirmative action and all that. So I was sort of on their side, and they knew that in terms of the substance. But I didn't preach to them about the First Amendment. I used to ask those black students, if you succeed in getting your university to ban hate speech, what do you think is going to happen next? You think you're going to be the ones to decide, or do you think the Board of Trustees is going to be the ones to decide? And the Board of Trustees are white, and the Board of Trustees don't share your politics. And the truth of the matter is, if there had been hate speech codes on college campuses in the 1960s, their most frequent victim would have been Malcolm X, not David Duke. And the kids would look at me like they had never thought of it that way. But that's the problem. The problem is always who gets to define what's hateful and who gets to decide what to ban. And it isn't often going to be the ones who advocate for these codes. The same thing happened in England in 1973 when the National Student Union banned hate speech, banned racist speech from college campuses in England. And a group of Zionist kids who were among the leaders of the national student movement at the time were all for that. And then a very few years later, the students changed. There were different students deciding, and they decided to ban a Zionist speaker on the grounds, they said, that Zionism was a form of racism. Well, the Zionist kids who had supported those hate speech bans, they didn't think that Zionism was a form of racism. But a few years later, a majority of the National Student Union did so think. And so the very hate speech bans that these kids supported ended up being used against their own speakers. There are hundreds of examples like that. And the reason why these bans don't work is that nobody can define what hate speech is, and it all ends up coming down to who decides. And most often, it ain't you.
Yeah, I mean, I can completely understand the position that a social media company would have, where they wouldn't want to have what they consider hate speech on their platform because they think it reflects poorly on them, and they also think that it radicalizes young people. It gets young people to think along the same lines. If they're very charismatic and they're enticing, they could get young people to join what they believe are hate groups.
Right.
But so is the solution just leave everything up and let everybody just kind of duke it out in the town square of ideas?
Well, I think so. And the reason I think that is that the only alternative is to give somebody the power to decide what should be excluded from the town square. And who is that somebody?
Right.
I don't think you can get out of that dilemma. At the very beginning of our history, when the First Amendment was first invented, we all learned in school that people like James Madison and Tom Jefferson and the rest of them were all these super advocates of free speech and First Amendment. But they weren't. A lot of them believed that the First Amendment did not protect false speech, because the same way that people now about hate speech is, well, what is the virtue of false speech? Why does false speech contribute anything to a rational discussion? How does false speech enhance democracy? So there was largely a consensus at the beginning of the end of the 18th century, when the country began. There was largely a consensus, even among the fiercest advocates of free speech, that false speech was not protected by the First Amendment. Then, under John Adams' presidency, the second president of the United States, they passed something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And this was a federal statute that Congress passed, and it made it a crime to say false things, critically false things about the president. And the problem is that it was the president who decided to whom that law should apply. So it ended up that people who were critical of John Adams, including a member of Congress, including several editors of newspapers, including lots of people they were arrested and convicted and sent to jail under this. And why did that happen? It happened because the people in charge said that their speech was false, the speech of the people that they prosecuted. And, when people think of true or false, they think of things like, well, if you say 2 + 2 is 5, we know that 2 + 2 is 4, so 2 + 2 is 5 is false. But in the world of politics, almost everything can be interpreted as true or false depending on who the speaker and who the listener is. Look at what just happened with our elections. 70% of people in this among Republicans believe that the election was fraudulent. Now, you can argue about whether that's true or whether that's false, but do you really want to make it a crime for people to say that the election was fraudulent? You have to fight it out. You have to duke it out. Otherwise, you're going to end up using these bans as weapons to use against people you don't agree with by simply claiming that what they said was false. That was the history in the early part of the American experiment. And the thing is true today about hate speech or bigoted speech or any other kind of speech. The price we pay for having the freedom to speak and listen and argue is that some of the stuff we have to hear is ugly. And it's like an insurance policy. And what we're insuring against is if we don't want to hear the ugly speech, if we want to ban ugly speech, we give the government the power to decide what's ugly enough to be banned. And then we'll lose our own rights to free speech for sure. And I don't think there's any way out of that. It's not intuitive. I used to say I was a kid who grew up in the streets of Brooklyn. If somebody called me a dirty Jew or insulted my mother or anything else, I mean, there were two responses. You didn't argue with. I didn't know about free speech when I was 11 years old on the streets in Brooklyn. If somebody insulted you or said something bigoted to you, you had two choices. You punched them out or you ran if they were bigger than you or there was more of them than you. Free speech is an acquired taste. It's something you learn about later. It's something I didn't understand really until I got to the ACLU and began to come to grips with these kinds of problems we're discussing now.
Was it an easy thing to come to grips with, or did you go back and forth with it? Like, was this like a...
No, it's not an easy thing to come to grips with because it's not intuitive. I mean, the first time I saw people from the Klan talking or neo-Nazis talking, my first instinct was I wanted to take a club and beat them over the head. I mean, how could your first instinct not be that? But I began to see that the consequences of that was to give the government, which was often going to be in the hands of people that didn't like what I believed, to give the government the power to decide who to beat over the head and for what speech. And I began to see pretty quickly, as you come to grips with these in real life cases, that if you give the government the power to decide what speech is ugly enough to be banned, it will as often be your speech as it will be the speech that you don't like. And that powerless people who are discriminated against, black people, women, gay people, Jews, Muslims, political minorities, socialists, communists, whatever. Those are never the people who get to decide what speech to ban. They are the victims of the speech bans because the people who get to decide are more often, as I keep saying, more often going to be people like Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon and Trump. And why would we want to trust? Why would Black Lives Matter protesters want to trust their speech rights to somebody like Donald Trump? Why would right-wing people want to trust their speech rights to Bernie Sanders, say? And, this doesn't often just break down on liberal conservative lines. I mean, remember that in one of the worst atrocities of civil liberties that this country has ever seen, American citizens of Japanese descent. These were not aliens. These were not immigrants. These were American citizens of Japanese descent. Not one of whom was ever charged with anything criminal or with anything treasonous or with anything traitorous. 120,000 of them were plucked from their jobs and their homes and their businesses and sent off to camps for the duration of the war for no other reason than that descended from Japanese people. And this was done by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the fact is, you can never trust the powerful with your civil liberties. That's true about speech, and it's true about all civil liberties. Power is the antagonist, not Republicans, not Democrats. Power is the antagonist, and whoever has it is a danger to civil liberties if they're not restrained. And one of the restraints is in the First Amendment to the Constitution, which says Congress shall make no law that abridges speech. Now, no law means no law. It doesn't mean some laws, and it doesn't mean, bad laws they can abridge, but not good laws, because you can't trust what they decide is good and what they decide is bad. So, yeah, I do think you got to duke it out with words. And the line between what's permissible and what's not permissible needs to be between speech and conduct.
Catch new episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience for free only on Spotify. Watch back catalog JRE videos on Spotify, including clips. Easily, seamlessly switch between video and audio experience. On Spotify, you can listen to the JRE in the background while using other apps and can download episodes to save on data cost, all for free. Spotify is absolutely free. You don't have to have a premium account to watch new JRE episodes. You just need to search for the JRE on your Spotify app. Go to Spotify now to get this full episode of the Joe Rogan Experience.